Facing calls to sack his top advisor following reports he broke lockdown rules. Dominic Cullings is said to have travelled with his wife and son to Durham, which is more than 260 miles from his London home, to stay with his elderly parents after developing coronavirus symptoms. Labour has demanded a swift explanation from Number 10, while the Lib Dems have gone a step further, saying that Mr Cummings should resign or be sacked.
I can't see, in my reading of the guidelines, that this is anything other than a very severe breach of those guidelines. I'm always someone who would like to hear an explanation, but I can't see how Dominic Cummings can wriggle out of this one. And I think he ought to do the decent thing today and to resign.
Let's bring in our political correspondent, Rob Powell, who joins us from Westminster. And still no official word from Number 10, Rob. How long can that last? Yeah, some 14 hours now since that story first broke, and nothing on the record yet from Downing Street. I think it's pretty clear they will have to offer some sort of explanation as the day progresses. All we've had overnight so far are anonymous briefings from so-called allies of Dominic Cummings, who did confirm that he and his wife and his son did go to Durham during that lockdown period after he started experiencing COVID-19 symptoms. The explanation being offered by these anonymous briefings and sources was basically he did it because they were struggling to care for his young son at home and needed family assistance. Reporters are being pointed towards one single comment from the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, where it says that in exceptional circumstances, if you can't look after a young child, then one of a number of care options you can get is to seek family support. Of course, that's one comment. You could point to a number of other comments from the Prime Minister, from top scientists, from ministers on online guidance, saying that if you have COVID-19 symptoms, you should not leave your home at all. You certainly shouldn't travel to another part of the country, especially when you're coming from a hotspot like London to a rural area like Durham, and you shouldn't be giving young children, asking for older relatives to care for young children because of the risk of young children carrying the virus but not showing symptoms or showing mild symptoms, but potentially passing it on to older people who may develop complications after that. So it certainly looks like Dominic Cummings's actions are, on paper anyway, in complete contravention to what the government has been saying for the past 8 or 9 months. I think what the message we're getting so far is that these were exceptional circumstances. But I think the question is, were these really so exceptional, and was there really no alternative to driving 260 miles to a rural area to be with your family? Now, Number 10 seem intent on toughing this out. Dominic Cummings is obviously very close to the Prime Minister. I think it'd be interesting to see how they explain this later today, and then what the reaction is of the wider Tory party and Tory MPs, because the risk is it looks to the public that there's one rule for people in government and another rule for everyone else. OK, Rob, thank you. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Tony Blair's former Director of Communications, Alastair Campbell. Mr Campbell, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Firstly, your reaction to the news that Dominic Cummings travelled more than 200 miles to Durham with COVID-19 symptoms.
Well, I think it's a reaction that will be shared by the millions and millions and millions of people who have abided by the rules. And all this guff about special circumstances, I mean, I'm sure I'm not alone in having friends whose funerals I've not been able to go to, in having a new member of the family who's been born, who we've not been able to go and see, in having a friend currently in hospital that neither we nor his family can go and see. And your reporter there saying that it seems as though there is one law for those who make the laws and another one for those who are meant to obey them. This is not a question of seeming. That is what is going on here. And it's all of a piece, I'm afraid, with the arrogance and the elitism of these people who won power by pretending to be on the side of the people against some sort of elite. And this is far worse, by the way, than Neil Ferguson and Catherine Calderwood, the Scottish medical officer. They weren't infecting anybody. Neil Ferguson, we know it was a private life issue, if you like. Catherine Calderwood, she was going to her second home with her family. This is a man who ran out of Downing Street, communicating to the world this sense of panic that, oh my God, this illness is so terrible. His wife has written for The Spectator and broadcast on the BBC about what she called their London lockdown. And it turns out they were lying the whole time about where they were, about what they were doing. And honestly, Boris Johnson, I've written a piece for the article website of this, Boris Johnson will try to keep him precisely because it does expose what liars and hypocrites they are.
I mean, you described the line from the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jenny Harris, as guff. I mean, she said it on the 10th of April. She said that being too ill to look after a small child was an exceptional circumstance. I mean, many of Mr Cummings' supporters will say this was an exceptional circumstance. Both he and his wife were poorly, and they travelled to his parents in order to protect the little child so the child can be looked after.
Well, all I would say, I think that whole, I'm not accusing of Jenny Harris of talking guff. They are the guidelines. I'm saying it is guff to suggest that this was the only way that this couple could have their child properly looked after. They have other family in London.
So what should he have done?
Well, I don't know the guy. I don't know his family circumstances. But when his boss, his Prime Minister, no doubt with the pen held by Dominic Cullings, has stood at a lectern and said that it is dangerous and wrong for people to have their children looked after by elderly grandparents, why on earth would he not think as he did that? As around him, there's all these stories about the Scottish medical officer, who I think was, now looks from the timeline, was resigning just as Dominic Cummings was spotted allegedly dancing to ABBA in the garden. I mean, I don't think people would mind if they thought this was a competent government that was on top of this crisis, that hadn't seen tens of thousands of people dying, while these people were telling us how to run our lives. But when they see such incompetence on top of this lying and the hypocrisy at the heart of it, please don't ask me to pretend that the country should, be worrying about whether Dominic Cummings and Mary Wakefield, they're in the top 1% of high earners in the country, that they couldn't find somebody to look after their son. That is what I mean by guff.
Many will say that we are still going through this pandemic. There is a long way to go. Is now the right time to be removing the Prime Minister's most senior advisor?
Well, I really don't care about that. Look, he's a political advisor. He not just had some sympathy with Nicola Sturgeon, for example, saying... But
an important advisor that was sitting in SAGE meetings. So, people will say, is now an appropriate time that he should leave. He is giving the Prime Minister crucial advice at this difficult time.
Please, honestly, the Prime Minister is what it's time for is the Prime Minister to start doing his job. His job is to lead the country. The fact we're even talking about Dominic Cummings, we hardly ever see Boris Johnson. He goes to Prime Minister's questions when he can't get out of it. He's not, I can't remember the last time he did one of these wretched briefings, and heaven help the poor, minister who's sent out to do it today. He's not a leader. He's not leading in a crisis. And what happens when that happens? You get a vacuum. I would rather, if we had a half-decent Prime Minister whose heart was in the right place, a competent set of cabinet ministers, nobody would give a damn about Dominic Cummings. It's the fact that these people are so incompetent that this matters so much.
I think it's unfair to say that the Prime Minister's heart isn't in the right place. I mean, many will say that he is doing his very best under very difficult circumstances. But the Labour Party have demanded a swift explanation. The reality here is that Mr Cummings doesn't appear to be going anywhere anytime soon. What should happen now?
Well, let me just pick you up on the point about saying that whether the Prime Minister's heart is in the right place. Let me say why I make that point. These people won power by pretending to be on the side of the people, and they're not. That's what I mean by his heart not being in the right place. If he was genuinely motivated by getting this country through this crisis, in which tens of thousands of people have died, way more than they're admitting, then he would be out on the front line every day leading this, instead of which he hides away. So I will repeat, I do not believe his heart in the right place. As to what should happen to Dominic Cummings, for once, Boris Johnson should actually show a bit of leadership. He has been very badly let down, and he should therefore act upon it. And then he has to answer the question whether he is one of the small number of people that Laura Kuenssberg on the BBC has told us was aware Dominic Cummings had broken the lockdown rules. Then if that's the case, Johnson's got questions to answer for his own conduct as well.
Let's see what happens. Alastair Campbell, really appreciate you talking to us this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Kamal.